Okay, so got all the main passageways blown out, soaked them in brake cleaner, shot brake cleaner down, blew it out on the floor here. Now the next step you're going to do before you set your main bearings in, and this is going to apply for the caps as well, you take a rag that you know with absolute certainty is not going to leave behind any fuzz, any fibers, anything like that. This, for example, is one of those super high knit counter microfiber rags. And the reason I say that is because you have jagged edges all over. Last thing you want is to start shooting pieces of fabric. And as I say that, you guys just saw that little piece of fabric, which is not supposed to happen on these rags. But just make sure there is zero fibers left behind. And you see that? We got it clean, and we're still wiping stuff off. And that's why I say to make sure to do this. So we're going to clean this. Anything that's underneath the bearing, between the block and the bearing, is going to change tolerance, which is a major, major no-no. So now we're going to do a final inspection. Oh, we got a little fuzz, but that's on the outside, so I'm not super worried about it. Kind of disappointing. That rag was supposed to be really, really good. Here's another one, if you guys can see it. And what I always do before I set the bearing is I take my thumb, because there's nothing like skin, and you just wipe it across, make sure it's all good to go. In this application, we are actually using, these are King bearings. And see right here, these are your thrust washers, so I'm going to talk about those as well. But the King bearings, so these are very, very high quality bearings for rotating assemblies. Some people like ACL, I like King. There's a lot of good stuff out there. These are actually, you know, you once could read this, but these are the 0.001 extra tolerance bearings. And the reason I went with this is because it allows you to get away with not putting as much stress on the oil pump and running a heavier weight oil. So in this application, we're actually going to be running like a 5W40, a modal 5W40 in this block. And being that, you know, the standard factory setup, the oil pump was designed for 5W30, the extra tolerance creates that little bit of extra volume to carry that heavier viscosity oil through all the bearings. So that being said, that's the choice I went with. Consult with your engine builder, you know, consult with people that are educated before you make a decision. But super simple. I mean, they even, as you can see right here, got them all labeled. Very, very hard to mess up. I'm going to show you how to put in there. They obviously all have lip grooves on them. As long as you know which way the caps go, you can't mess this up. Well, you can, but it's pretty difficult to. So we're going to first start by setting them in the block. Once we get them set in the block, right, I'm going to show you how to properly lube them. At that point, we are going to prep the brand new OEM crankshaft. See how dirty this is? Been sitting in the garage. It's going to need a really good cleaning before it goes in there. And once we get that clean, we're going to set it in. We're going to take our main caps. We're going to bolt it down. We'll be in business. All right, we got the package open. Again, make sure you clean them, okay? You see all this residue? That's a pre-coated lube that they put on them from the factory. However, the backside should be absolutely spotless. So what I always do, wipe down the backside. Do not put oil between the cap and the block, okay, or the bearing and the block. Do not lube them on the backside between block to bearing. Obviously, they get lubed on this side, not on this side. So the other thing you got to look at here is, do you see these? you see how there's no hole? Let me zoom out. There's no hole on this one. You see that? What that tells you, I'm going to show you a cap to give you an example. See how there is no hole on the cap? What that tells you is that set is for the caps. So you need to make sure that the side that has the groove in it, where oil is meant to flow through, has the hole for the oil on the bearing. All right, we got a couple installed so far. You see what I'm doing here? Do not drop them, but I'm wiping them down very, very well. Again, bare metal to metal. You want them absolutely spotless on the backside. Okay, so now what we're doing is I'm taking each main cap one by one, just hitting it with a couple back and forth of the 1000 grit. And that is just to make sure the surface is absolutely immaculate. Again, same concept that applies to the block applies here. We want them absolutely spotless. So basically what I do, I just take this and I just kind of roll it back and forth. Make sure it's nice and spotless. Once it is, wipe it down again with our high quality rag. Wipe it down, get it absolutely clean. And we're gonna wipe the bearing down. This one I already wiped down, super clean. Install it, do that one by one all the way through the order, and we'll be in business. So bearings on the block are installed. They're installed on the caps. Next thing's next, we're gonna clean the crank. Same principle applies here. This thing has to be absolutely immaculate, not a single speck of anything on it. As well as we need to clean every single one of these passages and make sure that there's no loose, metal particulates, no dust, no nothing. Again, you guys, I'm not in an engine room, okay? This is a demoed garage. I had sheetrock dust flying around the whole works. So if I wipe this, it's got dust on it. So what I need to do is clean this very, very, very well. We're not even going to lubricate it. All of our lube is going on the bearings. Okay, so clean this, bone dry, absolutely spotless. And then what we're going to do is we're going to bring it over. We're going to set it in the block. And I'm going to show you how to proceed from there. Make sure you also roll it, because if you clean one side, that does not mean the other side's clean. Now, I'm going to take my compressed air, I'm going to blow everything out, then I'm going to get a rag with brake cleaner on it after I clean my hands and get all this crap off, and I'm going to wipe it down manually by hand. Then I'm going to blow it out again, then we're going to lube our bearings, etc. All right, she's all clean. So, blow it out. Blow out all the passages, soak it, clean it, get it absolutely spotless, blow it out again. She's ready for install. This thing is looking good. Now, this is how your bearing surfaces should look. You see the reflection? If they don't look like that, you might want to consider, before you assemble your motor, sending it to a machine shop and having it polished. Or look at my video I made about polishing a crankshaft, because at one point we were going to use the used crankshaft, 160,000 mile crankshaft, which was in immaculate shape, but the fire ruined it, so we bought a brand new one. So let's move on. Time to lube these bearings. Engine assembly lube or engine oil. It's a common controversy. I am going to use engine lube. Excuse me. So the crankshaft is set in there. What I'm going to do, I'm going to pull this off, let you take a look. So basically same idea. Lube the living crap out of the cap bearing side. Set it on there. I don't put the bolts in. I just set all the caps on there for right now. The most critical part is make sure you don't get oil between the seat of the cap and the actual block itself where it mates. And the reason why is because, especially some of this thicker assembly lube, if you get lube under there and you go to torque it down, that can change the actual torque value. You get what I'm saying? There'll be a little bit of a layer built up between the two, and it's trying to clamp down between them. And depending on the type of assembly lube or the thickness of the oil, whatever else, just a bad deal. Do not get oil on those surfaces. That's the thing you got to pay attention to when you do this, because you want a metal to metal clamping force. You don't want any room for air. Now, if you'll notice here, right, I have all the caps on except number 4. And the reason why is because this is a thrust washer assembly. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to install the bolts on these 3 and these 3. We're not going to torque them. We're going to get them snug, okay, and I'll show you what I mean by snug, but we're not going to do a final torque until we torque everything down. But we want this all tight and we want this all strapped down so that we can move the crank a little bit, because if you look, see down in this channel, okay, and I'm going to point, you see that little L right there? If you look closely, there's one on either side. Now what happens is these thrust washers here, these thrust washers are designed for the crank to ride almost against it, right? With a little bit of an oil cushion, because what happens is, especially when you start throwing really high horsepower at motors, is that the crank can actually start to do this number, right? The crank can actually start, you get what's called crank walk, and the crank wants to pull, push forward, pull back, push forward, pull back, based on the reciprocating motion and, rhythmic vibrations of the motor. Long story short, the crank has to be able to move a little bit. Otherwise, if it was just locked in place and it had those vibrations and it was trying to move back and forth, it would just chew up the bearings, which we don't want. But what you also don't want is you don't want the crank walking back and forth, slamming into the bearing surfaces and chewing the bearings up as well. So what every motor, and I say every because it's, almost all motors have, is what's called thrust washers. Now what these do is we set them on the crank, we rotate them down in there, and they kind of get held in place by the crankshaft itself. And then on the cap side, I'll show you here. So on the cap side, you see this little notch, okay? There's a notch on that side and there's a notch on that side. So what ends up happening is when you slide the first half moon in, right, it's just like the bearing, it sits on the bottom. And then the second part gets sat in the bearing and actually locks into place here. So once I get these lower halves put in, I install the thrust washers as they're supposed to go. And there is a correct side and an incorrect side. I install these on the cap, and this little tab, this little detent locks into place so that it can't spin around, because if it started spinning, you got major problems. One, because it's going to step over this groove and instantly start riding into the crank, causing an exponential amount of metal shavings. Two, because it's actually going to start to force the crank one way or the other, which is not good. It'll chew up all the bearings. So, that being said, we got all our bolts here. I cleaned the bolts up for the most part. There's no rust on them anymore. What needs to happen is I need to get a little jar, and what I need to do is dip these in oil, take it out of the oil, let it drip off a little bit, and then install it, because we want all of these threads lubricated, as well as the heads, as well as the top of this area where the bolt actually has to twist and be able to torque, okay? And if you get oil on the threads and oil in there, but no oil on the top, and the top is riding metal to metal, as it tightens, it'll start to bind and cause friction, and it'll give you an incorrect torque value which is not what we're after. We want them all to be identical torque. We want them to be the proper torque. So I'm going to go ahead, get a little tub of oil here, start soaking them, installing them. We're going to get them snug, and then we'll proceed. So we're going one-handed again, but all right, here's an example. So I got a tub full of water, full of oil. The reason you want to let them drip off is you do not want a stream of oil falling in to the bottom of the port, of the threaded section. That creates a stoppage where you're trying to drive the bolt down and now it's bottoming out on oil. So we definitely don't want that. We want them lubricated, and that's why I get a bucket where I can drip them off and transfer them, because a lot of the oil will drip off of them, but they will remain in a wet, lubricated state. This is the exact same principle that will apply to the head studs. So what I'll do, I'll grab this one. You see how there's no more drips? Okay, no more drips. I'm going to take it. I'm going to work this bearing around. And it's hard to do with one hand, but oftentimes what will happen is you won't have it seated in the right spot, and you'll have to kind of wiggle the bearing around. Don't do it too aggressively, though. And the other thing, do not drive one side down first before the other, because that is just going to cause you problems. So we'll take this one again, drive this one down as well. Okay, once they're both in and snug, you're going to do this by hand. You're going to snug them by hand. So I got them snug down. The way I do this, I use a very, very stubby ratchet. And what I do is I just pull until it requires an immense amount of hand strength to turn them. And what you'll find is you'll be able to snug them all the way down like this. If you don't have a short ratchet, obviously, maybe you can just grab the ratchet right at the head of the ratchet and try it that way. Next thing you're going to want to do, and do not spin it continuously, because we're not trying to take the assembly grease and throw it into this area or even those bolt holes, but just make sure the crank moves very easy right now. It's exactly what it should. It's not torqued down. If it's binding or if something feels weird or it's not turning back and forth, you got problems. Take them back off. Try again. See what's going on. We're now at the part for the thrust washer. If you look, you see these little slots. You can see it if I hold it that way. So the thing to know about these, and they only fit one way, so this is very hard to mess up. I don't know if you even could, but the slots face the crankshaft. Does that make sense? So the smooth side against the block, the slots face the crankshaft. And I'm no, engine scientist, but what I believe that's for is oil passageway, to my knowledge, would be why that's there. But just make sure you install them the correct way. So the way this is going to work, again, slots towards it, okay? So you take this, and you're going to try to feed it in and around, if you guys can see that. Okay, see how it just did a 180? Now what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take the crank and push it so that it gets tight around this. Okay, so this is going to be really hard to do with one hand. You see it move? I know you heard it because I heard it. But yeah, you take it, push it, and wedge it so that it's tight against this side. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to install the other one. So now I'm going to loop the other one in there, and then I'm going to kind of try to center it. Now what you do with this cap over here is you rest them on here where they go in the groove. Okay, so again, slots are facing towards the crank. These go in the groove. The point should go in the hook. Hook should go in the point. So if that makes sense, you got a point here, a hook there. When you install the other one, and I'll give you an example here. Again, this faces the other way. So now if you see, you're going to have a point over there and a hook over here. So now what we're gonna do, we're gonna set this on here. We're gonna rotate it around. And it should just like you just saw, should just free float its way down. Okay, so now what I'm gonna do is take the crank and I'm gonna try to push it so it's a little bit more center. Okay, so now we got the thrust washers in there. Now we're gonna install the cap. And I'm sorry the camera's tippy, but kind of a no-brainer at this point. Install the cap as you would. Make sure they line up. They will line up if you set them in there the right way. Install the bolts, and we're going to go through torque. Cap is installed. Now you're going to take her. Make sure she spins freely. No binding, no weird noises. Make sure it spins very well. Okay, and the amount of resistance, literally I'm just grabbing a hand. Don't even have to squeeze really hard. Can turn it over. If there is something going on where it's, you need a ratchet or something to be able to spin it, at this point, before we even have torqued it, you have a major problem somewhere. Your bearings are incorrect size. Something's not right because we haven't even torqued this down yet. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go through the torque sequence. So I'm going to get out my torque wrench, show you how that works. And then the last thing we got to do is we got to check end play, which is, again, with the thrust washers, they're there so that the crank can move only a little this way, only a little that way. If it moves too much and we have too much end play, is what it's called, then we're going to have to do something differently with the thrust washers. Those are available in different sizes, etc. If you get a bearing set and you have a brand new crankshaft and you have a healthy block and you have all of that, your end play should be nearly perfect, okay? But don't run with that, because if the end play is not correct, that is one of the fastest ways to, once you start developing crank walk, one of the fastest ways, shoot out the bearings in the motor. And then once that happens, all your hard work, odds are it's going to take the crank with it, going to send metal throughout the motor. Not a good deal. So don't mess around with that.